When the repair shop restored my son's laptop, my old friend leaned in. "Freeze the funds and review the will." I only tapped my pen once and asked, "How long has this been planned?" 3 days later, as emails and call logs lit up the boardroom screen, the next heir stood pale and silent, unable to speak. Before we move on, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to see how far this voice travels. My name is Arthur Vance. I'm 64 years old. Every morning at 6:15, I still walk down to the wood shop, run my hand across the fine dust on the workbench, and listen to the table saw rip through the grain. That sound reminds me I'm still alive. My voice has gone rough after 40 years of breathing oak and cold glue, but my mind is sharp, like the chisel I used to carve customers' names into the edge of a cabinet door. I built Vance & Son Construction out of a leaking shed on the outskirts of Austin, where summer heat slaps you like a whip and winter splits your skin open. But I didn't quit. I put my soul into every joint, hinge, and promise I made. This company isn't branding. It's a vow. When Leo was born, I sat beside his crib watching his tiny fist wrap around my finger like he already knew this hand would guide him through life. When he graduated, I handed him the keys to the company. I told myself, he'll do great, but life doesn't always follow your faith. When Leo came back with an MBA from New York, he stepped into the shop wearing a navy suit, a polished watch catching the neon lights, eyes skimming over the wood grain like it was drywall. "Dad, we need to optimize processes," he said, pointing at diagrams on a 27-inch screen. Cold arrows, no warmth. The old crew exchanged glances. Someone sighed. I smiled, believing in the new generation. But that smile cracked like wet plywood. One morning I placed a piece of white oak on his desk. Straight grain, properly dried, $68 a board. "Customers can feel it when they touch," I said. He didn't look up. "Too expensive. We don't need it." His tone dropped like a hammer onto stone. I froze. Workers still called me Mr. Arthur, but their eyes followed Leo now, like a newer, shinier ship had docked. I wasn't being replaced because I was incompetent. I was being phased out because I didn't fit the new rhythm. Later that afternoon, I passed the conference room. Halogen lights washed over faces while Leo stood at the head of the table, hands slicing the air like a TED speaker. I heard words like scale, margin, market expansion. I pushed the door open. Silence. Leo smiled thinly. "Dad, this is internal. You should rest." The door closed behind me, hinges groaning like a warning. That night, I stood in the kitchen staring at steam rising from a mug I couldn't taste. My wife passed years ago, and our 2,300-square-foot house felt like a hollow warehouse. I heard Leo on the porch phone call, his voice low, hurried, and a sharp laugh that felt like glass. When he saw me, he covered the speaker, forced a smile. "Nothing, Dad, just work." That smile, thin as cheap paint on rotted wood. The next morning, I overheard a young worker whisper, "The old man still thinks he's useful." I stood 5 feet away. My chest tightened. I stared at a bent nail on the workbench and saw myself in it, once holding the frame together, now tossed aside. I tried talking to Leo. "Did you review the Parker Kitchen contract? They need—" He cut me off. "Not your responsibility. I'll handle it." "I just don't want complaints," I said. He looked straight at me. "Clients matter, but you don't understand the market anymore." That wasn't a sentence. It was a boot on my pride. Late that night, I sat on the porch watching streetlights glaze over peeling paint on the railing. The air smelled like damp leaves and cold dirt. I looked up at Leo's window, laptop glow reflecting off the glass. In that reflection, I saw ambition in his eyes, a type I used to admire. But now, something darker simmered. Hungry, corrosive. The kind you'd find in whispered stories about toxic family drama. I'm not sure when the gap between us turned into a canyon. Maybe when my advice stopped mattering. Maybe when clients started texting Leo instead of me. Maybe when I realized his smile shone brighter for strangers than for his father. Losing a role isn't painful. Losing a place in your son's heart is. Near midnight, the house fell silent. I heard the conference room door creak open. A hushed voice said, "We need to push him out before he turns into a problem." I stepped back, spine pressed to cold drywall, breath stuck halfway. I didn't see who spoke, but Leo's reply was clear. "Don't worry, he's old. Just a small push. He'll fall on his own." The words drove themselves into me, deeper than shattered glass. That wasn't suspicion. It was the first bloom of pure deceit under my roof. I returned to my room, closed the door, and stood in darkness. Outside, a truck passed, engine hum stretching my thoughts thin. I remembered buying wood at $120 a slab, delivering cabinets under pouring rain because I said I'd be there, staying up until 3 a.m., sanding edges smooth. And now it could all collapse with a single signature from my own son. I sat at the edge of the bed, hands trembling. Not from age, but because, for the first time in my life, I questioned whether a family's love could rot when ambition soaks too deep. When trust splits, wood cries out. And when wood cries, the sound travels farther than anyone expects. Last week, around 9 in the evening, the landline at the shop wouldn't stop ringing. The caller ID showed the Winslow family, clients of ours for over 13 years. I picked up, and Mrs. Winslow's voice trembled, like someone prying a nail from an old hinge. "Arthur, our kitchen design has been completely changed. Cheap materials, rough edges, and your son never warned us. We're thinking about canceling." Behind her, I heard her husband sigh, soft but heavy enough for me to picture the disaster in their kitchen. My grip tightened around the receiver, and a sharp ache spread across my chest, the way wood fibers tear when cut against the grain. I didn't say a word to Leo, not because I feared an argument, but because some lessons demand proof. When the clock struck midnight, I returned to the shop. The neon lights overhead flickered, tired, yellow, humming against the silence. The air smelled of oak dust and glue, warm and familiar. I picked out each board myself, straight grain, properly dried, $72 per slab. Not cheap, but quality has a weight of its own. I planed every edge, cut every mortise, installed Titan hinges. The sound of the planer echoed through the 2,300 square foot workspace like steady breathing. Now and then, a breeze slipped through the drafty door, sending sawdust swirling like old memories. Footsteps passed in the hall once, then vanished. Maybe a security guard, but my heart drifted to Leo, likely asleep in a warm bed while I patched the hole he'd made. 2 days later, I drove my old gray Ford pickup to 1182 West Culver Road. The Winslow house sat behind a white fence, lavender growing in tidy rows. The wind carried its scent, soft, like an apology. I unloaded the oak panels. Mrs. Winslow's eyes lit up, red from worry but warming. She laid her hand flat across the sanded surface and exhaled. "Yes, this is the feeling we remembered." When I finished installing everything, she hugged me, tears dampening the shoulder of my faded cotton shirt. "We knew you'd never let us down, Arthur." I didn't answer, because the word she meant for Leo had fallen into my lap. Mr. Winslow offered a check, $14,200, but I refused the bonus they tried to slip in. I only took what was originally agreed. Reputation doesn't grow through extra pay. It grows through trust. That night, while cleaning the office, I heard the printer whir. A single page slid out and fluttered to the floor like a warning note. I picked it up. Strategic consulting contract, Avalon Strategies. A total of $480,000 for 3 months. My eyebrows knotted. I'd never heard of them. Too expensive, too vague. Signed by Leo Vance. Dated last week, the same night the Winslows called. A wrong note in my well-rehearsed symphony. I sat down. Desk light shone across the page, revealing every crack like a beam across an old beam joint. I turned to the second page. Vague language everywhere. Optimize tangible assets. Adjust executive decision structures. Realign ownership. My finger hovered over the phrase tangible assets, and a cold shiver crawled up my spine. This wasn't about wood, it was about everything. Leo walked in. He froze when he saw the contract dangling from my fingers. "Dad, what are you looking at?" His voice trembled, but he forced calm. I placed the paper on the desk. "Explain this." He licked his lips, eyes darting to the window as if calculating escape. "Just growth strategy, Dad. It's a new era. We have to be flexible." I whispered, "Flexible or sell your soul?" His eyes darkened. "You don't understand." The silence thickened like wood glue setting. I stood, ran my hand along the oiled edge of the oak desk, and said quietly, "Foundation matters. If the foundation fails, the whole house collapses." He scoffed. "The house collapses because you refuse to evolve." The sentence drilled through me deeper than any screw. Past midnight, with the house asleep, I returned to the office and unlocked Leo's drawer with a spare key. Inside were additional copies, more emails, external consultants, subtle language referring to removal of obstructive leadership elements. I didn't want to believe he meant me, but ink doesn't lie, and actions shout. I leaned against the wall, breath shallow. My blood ran hot, but my hands chilled. I thought about the Winslows, smiling in their new kitchen. I thought about every handshake, every delivery, every promise kept. And I remembered how sweet revenge doesn't always mean a punch. Sometimes it means protecting what was always yours. Wind rustled through the trees outside, rattling loose shingles. I stared into the dark and told myself, if someone tries to knock down my foundation, I won't stand still. Revenge isn't always pain returned. Sometimes it's the quiet rise, the proof that they were wrong the moment they thought they'd won. I switched off the lamp. The room fell dark. But something bright had just sparked inside me. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. And tell me what time it is where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The next morning, I set the contract on Leo's desk. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, cutting across the glass surface like a thin blade. He barely glanced at it, eyes glued to his laptop. "Just a few new strategies, Dad. Nothing you need to worry about." His tone fell flat, like a dull saw dragging across plywood. He never looked me in the eye. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling the foundation beneath my feet soften. I didn't press further. I nodded. But behind that nod was silence, stretching like a shadow, observing, collecting every crack. A week later, Leo texted me in a rush. "Dad, spilled coffee on my laptop during the meeting. Take it to David for repair. I'm still in the conference." No apology, no guilt, just orders. He wiped the table, flashed a thin smile at a group of younger staff, and returned to their laughter. My hand tightened on the wet machine, cold along the metal hinge, a warning I could almost feel. That afternoon, David called. His voice was sharper than I'd ever heard. "Arthur, don't say a word. Come to my shop. Alone." My heartbeat slammed against my ribs like walnut against a chisel. I drove to a small store, its flickering signs swaying in the wind, electrical wires wrapped around the pole like tangled thoughts. David locked the door behind me. The latch clicked, sealing the room in thick air. He pointed at the monitor. "I can't fix the laptop, but I recovered some files." He paused, lifting his eyes. I'd only seen that look when someone discovered rot in the heart of a premium oak beam. "These aren't just work files." A cold line crawled down my spine. "Arthur, you should liquidate your joint accounts and revisit your will immediately." On screen, conversations, cost charts, appointment logs, the same phrase repeated, "Restructure executive authority." Each line felt like a nail hammered into the legacy I built. My hands trembled, but I forced them steady against the desk. "Tell me everything," I said. David's jaw tightened. "You're being positioned as an obstacle." Driving home, wind whistled through the cracked window, long, thin, like a rope tightening. Hours later, an email arrived from the bank. "Pending transfer request to Avalon Strategies." A figure so large I blinked twice. I'd never authorized it. I called the bank. The automated voice answered coldly. "Your call is important. Please hold." The looping music mocked me. That evening, a thick envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a letter from a private neurologist 4 blocks from our headquarters confirming an appointment to assess cognitive decline. I never scheduled it. Fresh, clinical paper smelled of sterility, uncaring and indifferent. "Who arranged this?" I whispered. The only reply was the wind dragging across the porch. I stopped sleeping. Whenever I closed my eyes, I heard footsteps along the hallway, then silence. I sat up, staring into the dark. The house felt foreign, each corner hiding doubt. One morning, I found the key to my archive drawer flipped the wrong way. A contract vanished, then reappeared hours later in the right spot. Not clumsy, not accidental, intentional. Leo was staging mistakes, painting me as confused. During a staff meeting, I presented a delivery schedule. The system showed something entirely different. 14 employees stared as if I'd forgotten. Whispers skittered behind me. Maybe he's slipping. Leo stepped forward, feigning concern. Dad, maybe you should rest. His eyes, beneath the sympathy, glinted with quiet victory, the sheen of deceit. That night I stood before the bathroom mirror. Warm yellow light traced the creases on my forehead like cracks in aging lumber. I touched my cheek. The reflection stared back, distant, tired. Am I losing it? I murmured. But deep inside, something growled back. No, they want you to believe it. Memories surfaced. Leo as a child running through the shop, loving the smell of pine, asking how every chisel worked, proudly showing his first sketch of a table to his mother. Back then his eyes were soft. Now they were cold, hardened by ambition. He wasn't alone. Isabel Crowder, an external consultant with a steel-flat smile, fed him language sharp enough to slice heritage apart. I finally understood. It wasn't just about money. He wanted my leadership, my legacy, my dignity erased. He wanted the board to look at me and see a burden, a splinter sticking out of polished wood. That night as I lay down, I felt an invisible cord wrap around my throat, tightening. Slow. Silent. Pressure from every angle filling my lungs with panic. Confusion, shame, anger, they crawled over me like ants on freshly cut bark. I stared at the ceiling, eyes wide, and I heard my father's voice from long ago. When rot hides in the core of the wood, only fire settles truth. If Leo wanted fire, then fire he would get. And when flames reveal truth in this twisted piece of family drama, I wouldn't be the one burning. In the darkness, I exhaled, calm, cold, ready. The noose had tightened, but so had I. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wall clock in the hallway ticked and talked, each sound like a drill boring into my skull. I got out of bed and walked quietly toward the living room. Through the narrow window of the front door, I saw Leo standing on the porch, his back turned, the streetlight washing a thin shadow across his shoulders. He held his phone between his cheek and shoulder, voice low and cold, colder than I'd ever heard it. Isabel, don't worry. Once we get that certification from the private neurologist, everything falls into place. The old man is just a sentimental fool. He'll never suspect his own son. Yes, after that, total control belongs to us. I froze. A sentimental fool. Those 3 words shattered inside me like shards of broken glass. I felt the world tilt. Not because of money, not because of the company, but because the person I'd spent my entire life raising saw me as a barrier to be removed. I swallowed hard and stepped back into the darkness of the living room. I stood there, fists clenched, whispering into the night, what did I do wrong? But somewhere under the weight of that question, something flickered to life. A flame, sharp, cold, focused, and for the first time I felt anger, not as fire, but as direction. The next morning I went to the workshop. My hands moved, but my mind drifted far from the smell of sawdust and varnish. Images surfaced. Leo as a child, sticky fingers covered in wood glue, smiling when he hammered his first nail straight. Now that same boy was forging signatures in the shadows. I called David, my voice barely carried. Did you hear anything else from that laptop? There was silence, then his voice dropped. Yeah, Arthur, there are recordings, calls between Leo and Isabel. They're planning how to support a medical diagnosis. It's not just business strategy. They're trying to make you look confused in front of the staff. My knees weakened. I sat down slowly, like a tree trunk losing balance. We're going to need evidence, David added. Evidence. That's when I began to think like an investigator. I started documenting everything. Dates, unusual meetings, deleted schedules, unexplained expenses. I checked older security footage. Frames where unfamiliar faces walked in and out while Leo was conveniently absent. I printed emails, filed transcripts, categorized spreadsheets. Each sheet felt like a plank in a bridge I would cross later, toward the truth. One afternoon, I walked past Leo's office with a hot cup of coffee in hand. He didn't notice me. He was on a video call with someone I hadn't seen before, someone expensive. Their voice hissed through the speaker. Make it look natural. Late deliveries, wrong invoices, missing signatures. He'll appear forgetful. My hand tightened around the cup. I didn't open the door. I didn't breathe. Instead, I let him speak. Let him build his own gallows. That night, I spoke with a few older craftsmen, men who had worked beside me for 20 years. They looked at me with worry, like you'd look at a mentor fading in front of you. "Arthur, are you okay?" one asked. I forced a smile, just tired. But I could feel their doubt creeping, slow as termites. The incidents escalated, orders misplaced, delivery dates altered, internal calls mysteriously disconnected. Small things, small enough to blame age. And then employees whispered when I walked past. Their eyes followed me the way you watch a shelf about to collapse. Later that night, Leo came home late. There was perfume on his collar, the smell sharp and unfamiliar. He sat across from me and met my eyes with a strange glint. "Dad, you're too simple," he said, leaning back. "Being decisive doesn't mean destroying what's sacred," I replied quietly. He scoffed. "Values don't pay bills." That stung. I lifted my chin. "Money is not the end goal." He checked his watch. "And that's why you'll always lose." Then he left the room. That sentence stayed with me, echoing like hammer strikes inside an empty workshop. Over the next week, I watched him from a distance. He met with consultants. He convinced younger employees with raises and promises. He scheduled a neurological evaluation behind my back. He rearranged documents to appear misplaced, and every piece of the puzzle clicked together. He wanted me declared incompetent. Not sick. Not weak. Legally gone. One night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. A dim lamp cast a halo on the plaster overhead. I felt something invisible tightening around my throat. Pressure without hands. My breathing grew shallow, like someone had shut a vent inside my chest. But then I remembered something my father once told me in the workshop. When rot hides in the core of the wood, only fire can reveal it. If Leo wanted fire, he would have it. Not rage, not fists. The fire of evidence. The fire of truth. I spent the next days gathering, organizing, dating. Every item labeled. Every face logged. Everything prepared for the board. And while I worked, a strange calm settled over me, a cold clarity. I thought of a phrase, sweet revenge, but not the petty kind, the kind that restores balance, that shows everyone who is right. Before sleeping, I closed my notebook and whispered, "Tomorrow, we begin." And that night I slept better, not long, but peacefully. Because now I wasn't a cornered man. I was a man ready to strike the match. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing. It helps the channel grow, and I truly appreciate it. Leo's biggest mistake was arrogance. He assumed I was blind to technology, just an old man who understood wood grains, glue, and the sound of chisels tapping against steel hinges. But he forgot something. I built this company before email even existed, and to survive 4 decades, I learned a little more every year. Sometimes, what destroys a perfect scheme is the smallest thing: a data log, a hidden folder, a corrupted file. That night, rain sprinkled over Austin. I sat in my small office at the end of the hallway, the yellow desk lamp stretching my chair's shadow across the hardwood floor. David sat opposite me, the faint smell of burnt coffee rising from the old machine in the corner. The glow of his laptop cast a cold blue wash over his face, lines of code flowing like a river. "Arthur," he muttered, "you're going to have to stay calm. We're going deeper into the server." I nodded, gripping the armrests. Each file that surfaced cut like a thin blade across my chest. Emails between Leo and Isabel, strange internal chats, private meetings with unfamiliar names. Every piece pointed toward a single plan: remove me from leadership, strip me of voting power, and transfer control through the board. "What's he saying there?" I whispered, my voice low and rough. David frowned. "They're calling you an emotional liability, a soft factor slowing the company down." He exhaled. "I hate when people use pretty words to describe ugly things." We continued digging. In the hidden folder of recordings, we found one flagged with importance. I clicked play, and Leo's voice poured into the room, sharp as ice. "We just have to make him look incompetent. The capacity evaluation is just formalities. Isabel will handle the doctor. When the board believes it, he'll step down." Then came a short laugh, cruel, hollow. I closed my eyes. A heavy silence pinned me in place. I remembered the nights when he was young, when he leaned his head on my shoulder during football games, holding a cold root beer. I didn't recognize the man in that recording. Maybe betrayal doesn't start loud. Maybe it whispers first. Arthur, David said softly, we need financial motive. I opened my eyes. Keep going. We accessed hidden payroll tables, funds shifting to a consulting shell called Avalon with no real address. Then, among server logs, came order schedules manipulated to anger clients, and every delay blamed on me. Irritability, forgetfulness, confusion. They were constructing a profile, brick by brick. David leaned back. This is sophisticated, very. I gave a humorless smile. Sophisticated still means flawed. Every web has a weak strand. Outside, rain tapped against the old tin roof. The scent of wet earth drifted into the room. I rose, walked to the desk, and placed my palm on the small black USB. It felt light, but its weight could bend the entire arc of my life. In that dim lamp glow, I saw the shape of something forming, not hatred, but justice. Maybe even revenge earned, not taken in anger. I want this saved to 3 copies, I said quietly. David smirked. Still paranoid, huh? I call it experience, I replied. We worked until sunrise. The room held its breath as the laptop fan hummed, the lamp flickering over tired eyes. When the final export completed, I stared at those folders like they were tombstones, proof that someone who shared my blood could treat me like an obstacle. Arthur, David asked gently, are you okay? I don't know, I said. When a stranger betrays you, you get angry, but when your child does... My voice trailed off. Morning fog rolled in behind the building. Pale pink light washed over the oak desk, the same surface I hand-sanded 20 years ago. I ran my fingers across it, cool and smooth. Solid. Right then, I understood. I wasn't fighting to keep a chair. I was fighting to keep myself. And sometimes silence lights the fuse for sweet revenge. I nodded, finally feeling the invisible rope loosen around my throat. The evidence was ready. A storm was coming, but this time, I would be the one holding the wheel. I remember the exact feeling the first time I listened to that recording. The audio crackled slightly, a door clicked shut, and then Isabel Crowder's voice sliced through the static like a cold blade. Leo, you have to make him look pitiful. When we bring him to court, everyone should believe we're saving him from himself. That's the art. Leo hesitated for a moment, his voice wavering before hardening into something uglier. You're right. It's time for him to retire, permanently. Isabel's quiet laugh followed. No warmth, just emptiness. My face burned as blood rushed upward. This wasn't just financial maneuvering anymore. This was theater, a performance designed to turn my life into an exhibit of incompetence, a masterpiece of cruelty crafted with surgical calm. They had arranged everything, a private doctor willing to deliver a conveniently biased evaluation, employees promised promotions if they cooperated, orders deliberately altered to create my mistakes, and a string of stage complaints from customers. Each incident was small enough to be dismissed alone, but devastating when linked together. A mosaic of decline, evidence of a fading mind. I replayed the audio several times. Each time I noticed something new. A tone shift, a breath, a pause. They wanted the downfall to feel organic, inevitable. Authentic. That was the word that chilled me. But they forgot one thing. When you corner an animal, it stops running. It watches. Every trap they set left behind residue. The altered emails still held metadata. The shipment logs recorded changes. And the younger employees promised glory. They whispered to each other. Fear breeds loose tongues. I saved the audio file in an encrypted folder, time-stamped everything, and printed the transcript. Ink on paper feels heavier than pixels on glass, more real. I listened again to Isabel instructing Leo to schedule a cognitive exam at a rented medical suite downtown, a legal facade with nothing behind it. Leo talked about adjusting delivery schedules, and I heard the soft exhale of someone who'd misplaced their conscience years ago. These were not whispers, they were signatures. Their ambition didn't stop at paperwork. They wanted a string of incidents for the board to notice. Lost invoices, missed appointments, a meeting I was late for because they printed the wrong time on my calendar. Enough sand tossed into the gears that the machine would fail and the blame would land neatly at my feet. I called my attorney, but before I sat in front of any committee, I needed perspective. I dug through server logs, compared versions of emails, and pulled original backups. One line stood out in particular. Delay intentional, replacing delay approved. One word, one keystroke. A deliberate sabotage disguised as senility. Further down the rabbit hole, I found financial transfers, small, scattered amounts dispersed across multiple accounts. Quiet bribes, incentives. Nobody would notice a few thousand a month when millions flowed through the books. But I wasn't looking at the dollars. I was looking at the fingerprints. Late one night, I found a camera feed, a tall man, dark coat, entering the garage at 2:07 a.m. Not an employee. 10 minutes later, an admin login accessed the internal counsel server. The timestamp and the man's silhouette overlapped perfectly. They had left footprints in the digital snow. Anger didn't fuel me. Focus did. I didn't want to explode. I wanted to dismantle. Slowly, precisely, like a carpenter removing nails without splintering the wood. I called old clients, not as an executive, but as a craftsman. "Hey, Parker, remember that kitchen cabinet I built in '06? I've been thinking about a few details." Their voices softened. They remembered. They validated. 20 years of credibility is something no fake doctor can overwrite. I visited old workers. They told stories, crisis nights, busted deadlines saved by steady hands. Every testimony was a nail sealing a coffin. When I laid folders of evidence in front of my attorney, he skimmed through them, eyebrows tightening. "Arthur, this is coordinated. You have proof of intent, misappropriation, manipulation. This is more than internal politics." My heart flipped, light and heavy at the same time, like a plank shaved thin enough to bend, yet strong enough not to break. I didn't want a dramatic confrontation, not yet. Timing is everything. Accuse too early and they retreat to safety. Wait too long and evidence evaporates. It had to be like joinery, cut, slot, pressure, perfect alignment, or the whole frame collapses. Their brilliance was arrogance, mine would be patience. Before leaving that night, I paused at the window. The workshop lights flickered through the rain. The wind carried the smell of wood glue and cedar dust. I whispered to no one, to everything. Let's see who the real craftsman is. When dawn arrived, the game would begin, and I was ready. If this story resonates with you, consider subscribing, and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. I'd love to know how far it goes. I truly appreciate it. The annual board meeting began right on time. The lights above were bright, cold, and unforgiving, as if they were designed to expose every crack. Leo stepped onto the stage in a sharp black suit, hair slicked back, one hand holding a carefully written speech. His voice came soft, polished, rehearsed. "Ladies and gentlemen, it pains me to say this, but my father's mental health has declined severely. He's made poor decisions that have harmed this company. For the sake of Vance & Son, and for his own good, I suggest he retire completely. I will assume full control." A few polite claps drifted across the room like thin raindrops. Eyes turned toward me, some sympathetic, some curious, some already avoiding responsibility. Leo glanced at me with a gentle smile, but his eyes held the smugness of someone who believed the verdict had already been written. Slowly, I rose and walked toward the podium. I said nothing. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small black USB drive. Its metal felt cool against my fingers. The screen behind Leo glowed alive, throwing harsh white light across his face. I plugged the drive into the projector. The room fell into absolute silence. The first email appeared. Subject lines, timestamps, sender routes, striking like needles of truth. Then came the internal chats, sharper, crueler. I opened an audio file. Leo's voice filled the hall, stripped of polish, dripping with condescension. "The old man is just an emotional fool." The echo seemed to stretch forever. Leo's confidence snapped. His face drained to a pale white. In the front row, Isabel Crowder froze like a marionette whose strings had suddenly been cut. I held his gaze, and for the first time in months, my voice turned steel. "You're right, Leo. I may be old, but I'm not stupid. And you forgot the first lesson I ever taught you. A foundation must be solid. Yours was built on lies. And it just collapsed." Someone gasped, another covered their mouth, a shareholder quietly began to cry. My attorney stepped forward, laying evidence onto the table piece by piece. Transaction logs, printed emails, financial discrepancies, transcripts of every recorded call. Each document landed with the weight of a gavel. Leo snapped, attempting to salvage the narrative. "These files are fake. Someone's trying to frame me." But his voice trembled, hollow. A board member leaned forward. "Then explain these transfers, Leo." He had no answer. Isabel shot to her feet. "Someone must be using my name." But her tone betrayed her. too polished, too late. The thread she pulled couldn't undo the tapestry. The board called for an emergency vote. With an overwhelming majority, they suspended Leo's voting rights and froze all assets related to outside consulting. The room buzzed with judgment. Quiet, sharp, unavoidable. Investigators moved immediately, reviewing server logs, reaching out to the bank, and scheduling interviews. Dozens of eyes followed Leo, cornered, breathing shallow, his world shrinking. He looked at me once more, eyes red and small, as if he finally understood the worth of the thing he destroyed. Trust. I offered him a single sentence, calm and heavy. Now face the consequences. It landed like a hammer. Clients approached afterward to shake my hand. Their words were soft, fragmented, but sincere. "We stand with you." Their grip was warm, real, unlike the performative pity earlier. That night, back in my workshop, I sat alone with the low hum of the old overhead light. My palm rested on the wooden table I'd sanded 20 years ago. I thought about how fragile trust is, how easily it splinters, and how truth, once revealed, doesn't need to scream. I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed, deeply, evenly. Victory, I learned, isn't about revenge. It's about restoration, repairing the structure you once built with bare hands. Through the window, the streetlights glowed softly along the road toward home. There were wounds left to heal, conversations left unsaid, and long silences waiting to be broken. But for the first time in months, I slept lightly, with peace instead of dread. The boardroom felt sealed behind invisible glass. The white lights overhead reflected sharply across the polished table, exposing every quiet breath in the room. I heard a faint metallic tremor from a chair leg tapping the floor, like the heartbeat I was trying to steady. My attorney, who had been sitting silently in the corner, rose and adjusted the button of his gray suit jacket. His voice was calm enough to cut steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have substantial evidence of an organized scheme to seize control of company assets and executive authority. All files will be forwarded to the proper authorities." No one breathed. A board member brought a trembling hand to her mouth, eyes wide, frozen. Somewhere behind me, pages flipped, then stopped. Pens tapped, then fell still. No one dared interrupt. Years of trust, reputation, sacrifice, now projected on the screen like shattered glass. A chill ran down my spine, even though my jacket was buttoned tight. The chairman tapped the table once. "We will vote now." Electronic ballots vanished into the darkness of their screens. It only took seconds, but it felt like an hour. Results flashed. Immediate suspension of all executive powers and voting rights held by Leo. Simultaneously, the board initiated an emergency internal investigation. A quiet exhale rippled through the room, but no one smiled. Isabel Crowder shot to her feet, voice shaking. "Everyone is misunderstanding. I'm only a consultant." My attorney didn't even need to raise his tone. "We've already filed for a temporary freeze on assets tied to irregular transactions. Until the court rules, I recommend you stay within the city." Her high heels struck the glass floor, echoing uncertainty with every step. Panic turned her shoulders stiff. Leo, meanwhile, didn't move. The confidence stitched into his expensive suit had been stripped thread by thread. He tried to speak, but his throat locked around every email, every message, every careless word he had left behind. His breath trembled. His eyes lowered, as if the floor could swallow him whole. A board member whispered, "Leo, do you have anything to say?" Silence. Only shallow breathing. Being caught isn't the real moment of pain. It's realizing no one believes you anymore. I stepped back, resting my hand against the cold, glossy edge of the table. My fingers trembled uncontrollably, not out of fear but relief. For months I'd been dragged through the shadows of deceit with no explanation. Now light carved through every corner of the room. My attorney leaned close. "We've won the first round, but brace yourself. People like them don't quit easy." I nodded. I knew. Wounds from family drama don't stay inside boardrooms. They seep into dinners, nightmares, memories, and pride. Leo looked at me one last time. There was no hatred there, just emptiness, like someone had pulled the foundation out from under him. And in that moment, I didn't hate him. I just felt sorry. Everything I ever taught him, used the wrong way. Chairs slid in. Folders snapped shut. Shoes rushed across polished floors. I remained the last one standing, watching the cold air cling to the curtains. When the door slammed behind me, my lungs filled deeper than they had in months. That weight on my chest dissolved. and all I could whisper was, "Trust breaks once. It never returns whole." Then I walked away, leaving bruised silence behind the heavy glass door. A few weeks after the board meeting, an anonymous email reached my attorney. 2 scanned contracts attached, blurred seals, rushed signatures. The partner listed on the last page wasn't any consulting group we'd ever hired, but a fund hidden behind a web of shell entities. At the center sat Isabel. The condition was simple. Once control slipped from my hands, the equity would be restructured and sold off in 60 days. Leo was nothing but a bridge. Clean suit, right spot, easy to snap in half. I sat in my tiny workshop office as afternoon light poured through the window, wood dust floating like brown snow. My phone buzzed. David's voice was low. "It's clear now. Isabel never stood with Leo. She stands with Prophet." I paused, listening to the metal roof groan under the wind. "I know," I finally answered. Bad news arrived holding cold hands. Leo's access badge was revoked, company accounts frozen, and a handful of consulting deals were placed under review. Friends stepped back. His phone went so quiet that even bank alerts sounded like mockery. Then one drizzling afternoon, my attorney's assistant called. "Mr. Vance, he wants to meet." The law office sat on the 10th floor, blue glass overlooking Houston Street. The small conference room smelled of new leather and bitter coffee. Leo walked in, noticeably thinner. Stubble shadowed his jaw, his shirt wrinkled near the cuffs. The bags under his eyes looked like wells dug deep. He sat across from me, never touching the water glass. After a long silence, he whispered, "I'm sorry." I didn't answer. I waited. Rain tapped the windows like a patient drum. He breathed in, voice trembling. "I just wanted to prove I could do it. I was tired of hearing everyone say, 'That's your father's company.' I wanted out from under your shadow. Isabel said, if we moved fast enough, everything would be ours. I didn't think it would go this far. I was blind." I stared at his hands, those same fingers that gripped a hammer beside me when he was 15. I remembered his laugh, the summer smell of varnish in 2003. Those memories dragged me back, then let me fall. I asked softly, "Ever think about the day we placed our very first board on the frame together?" He nodded, tears rolling quietly. "I remember, but I was afraid I'd never be more than Arthur's son." I set a black folder on the table, neat and heavy. "You attacked your own foundation, and the worst part isn't losing money. It's that you broke the only pillar holding you upright, trust." I paused. "You didn't tear down a business. You tore down a home." He wept. "Can you forgive me?" That question crossed between us like a velvet-wrapped knife. I turned to the window, traffic lights shifting colors, strangers crossing under umbrellas. Forgiveness doesn't erase, it acknowledges the crack and chooses not to push harder against it. "Your regret is real," I said, "but it's late. Time doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it teaches us how to live next to the pain." Leo bowed his head. "I understand." The attorney entered, sliding a cooperation agreement across the table. Reduced penalties if Leo testified truthfully about Isabel and the irregular deals. I looked him straight in the eyes. "This isn't a shortcut. It's the only road left." He signed, his hand shaking. The pen clicked shut with a dry snap, like the last nail sealing a coffin of arrogance. That night I returned to my workshop. Pine and varnish eased the weight in my chest. I clamped a slab of oak, set my steel square, and cut a thin, clean line. The blade hummed, a steady prayer. I realized a sun may break the piece, but the craftsman repairs what remains. Not to return to yesterday, but to ensure every grain is checked under light from now on. The following morning, recordings leaked to the news. Isabel telling a fund representative, "I don't need him to hold anything. I only need him to open the door." Her entire scheme required Leo as a disposable key. Once the lock turned, the key would be thrown away. I stood at my office window, golden light pooling across my desk, understanding justice walks on foot while deceit rides fast. But when justice arrives, it lingers. I wasn't seeking revenge to mirror pain. I needed order, a promise that the beginning wouldn't repeat itself as the end. Leo called at sunset, his voice rasped. "I'll tell everything. I'm done hiding." I said, "Tell the truth like you'd set a dovetail joint. Tight, clean, no gaps." Silence on his end. Then an exhale that sounded like a stone dropping. After dark, I drafted a letter for the board. commitment to transparency, a responsible transition, an honest closing chapter to a family tragedy. My signature wavered with age but stayed straight. Strangely, I felt lighter, not because I'd won, but because I refused to look away from the wreckage. I didn't promise Leo a hug. I didn't promise we'd be the same again. I simply cracked open a narrow door where every step is a debt paid. Behind me, the workshop's machines powered down. Ahead, the city lit up like a map redrawing its roads. And when I locked up, I knew I would go on, bearing visible join lines like wood's natural scars, imperfect but sturdy. One day, maybe we'll speak of shade and sunlight. Today is only enough to admit a shadow never saved anyone. We're saved by stepping out of it. And I chose to step into the light, slow, steady, listening to my heartbeat again. Not an ending, a beginning carved by calm hands. A quiet, sweet revenge of rebuilding from the foundation. I sold most of my shares in Vance & Son Construction, signing each page under the cold white office lights. Every stroke of the pen closed a heavy, exhausting chapter. I kept only the small woodworking shop on the edge of town, where the scent of pine and the hum of sawdust had been the steady heartbeat of my life. I renamed it Vance Woodcrafts, a simpler name, smaller, but mine. No more pressure stacked on my shoulders like damp, warped lumber. No more endless meetings, no suspicious glances, no silhouettes waiting to exploit the word family. Just the crackle of chisel against grain, sun spilling through old windows, and the slow breathing of peace. Each morning I wake with the smell of bitter coffee, unlock the shop while dew still clings to the grass. My hands trace the lines of every board, listening to the stories hidden inside each ring. Customers sometimes ask, "Why don't you expand?" I smile. I once chased big things. Now I want what fits in my hands. It's a quiet philosophy, a subtle, sweet revenge against the whirlwind of ambition that almost swallowed me whole. One afternoon, the prairie wind rolled in, carrying dust and the scent of dry grass. The landline rang, sharp and unexpected. I answered. "Arthur?" A woman's voice trembled. I stayed silent for a breath. It was my ex-wife, Leo's mother. We hadn't spoken in years, drifting apart like rivers, losing each other at the fork. "I heard what happened," she said softly. "You've always been the stronger one. I found some of Leo's old journals, from when he was 13, 14. Maybe they'll help you understand." The sunset outside the glass glowed like a healing wound. "Send them," I replied. No apology on his behalf, no rushed repairs, just a narrow crack of light, thin enough to be ignored, bright enough to soften even the firmest heart. The journals arrived a few days later. The handwriting was shaky, juvenile. I'm scared I'll never be as good as Dad. My chest tightened. So this storm, this painful family drama, had once been a frightened boy's shadow. Tonight I sit on the porch, feet resting on a step I once built by hand. Autumn is slipping into Texas, carrying smoke from faraway barns and the earthy scent of dry soil. A cup of hot tea warms my palms, steam rising like time exhaling. The hills in the distance swallow the sinking sun, turning the sky a deep amber. For the first time in years, my chest is light, as though someone finally removed a stone lodged inside me. I know forgiveness doesn't erase anything. It's the choice to stop gripping the blade that cuts you. But forgiveness has boundaries, especially when the wound comes from the very hand you once held. Will there come a day when Leo and I can cross this broken bridge? I don't know. But tonight, I leave a door cracked open, just wide enough for a draft, just wide enough so hope doesn't suffocate. I stand, switch off the porch light, lock the shop door. In the darkness it becomes clear. Peace always asks for payment, and I paid in tears, years, and pieces of pride. Yet in return, I have a life trimmed neatly. I am the craftsman of my own breath. I choose each thought like a plank of oak. I sand down bitterness. I glue what truly matters. If you're listening to this story, remember, some things must be put down so your hands are free to build again. And if your heart's been betrayed, don't let the darkness write the rest of your pages. Thank you for staying with me. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing so others can hear it too. I wish you and your family health, warmth at dinner, and laughter in your home. And if you'd like to stay, click on the next video. Another story is waiting there, and maybe, just maybe, it's the reminder you needed today.